30,000 years ago, during a brief warm period when sea levels were still low and long before the vast glaciers began to melt, a string of dugout canoes paddled north with purpose along the coast of East Asia. The paddlers, ancestors of the ancient Minatogawa people of Okinawa, followed the coastline northward, hugging coves, resting on islands, and timing their journeys to the rhythm of the tides. They were not simply hunter-gatherers chasing game, they were explorers, children of a seafaring lineage whose roots stretched back through Southeast Asia into the warm forests of southern China. These voyagers, who left faint genetic traces across the Pacific Rim, were the forerunners of the Jōmon of Japan and far across the ocean of the earliest Americans. For decades, anthropologists imagined that the first Americans trudged across a frozen corridor from Siberia to Alaska near the end of the last ice age. But a new picture has emerged from the combined force of ancient DNA and archaeology. It suggests that a much older maritime migration flowed north along the Asian coast tens of millennia earlier, carrying a population that would ultimately seed the Americas. The same ancestral group gave rise to the Jōmon of the Japanese archipelago, hunter-fisher foragers whose deep-set eyes and broad faces appear in old photographs strikingly similar to the indigenous peoples of the Pacific coast of the New World. To trace that connection, scientists have begun to reconstruct the genomic landscape of East Asia during the late Ice Age. As a new study, reconstructing the human population history of East Asia through ancient genomics makes clear the first anatomically modern humans arrived in the region no earlier than 50 to 55,000 years ago, spreading rapidly along two great corridors, one inland through Central Asia, the other along the southern coast of China and Southeast Asia. The coastal branch, which skirted the edge of the Pacific, carried the genes of people already adapted to warm, humid environments, perhaps even interwoven with remnants of older, archaic humans like the Denisovans. These coastal settlers gave rise to what geneticists now call the East and Southeast Asian lineage, a vast ancestral stock that would later fragment into the northern and southern East Asians, the Austronesians who would populate Polynesia, and a still deeper branch known as the Australasian or Southern hunter-gatherer lineage. Within that genetic tree lies a ghostly signal shared by Papuans, Aboriginal Australians, and unexpectedly a faint echo in the genomes of certain ancient South Americans. It is this echo, an Australasian genetic signature preserved in Patagonia and Brazil, that has forced scientists to reconsider the timeline of the Americas' peopling. Rather than a single migration 12 or 13,000 years ago, the genetic data now point to an earlier wave, perhaps around 30,000 years ago, when sea levels were lower and the Asian coast was a continuous ribbon of forests, estuaries and islands stretching from Indochina to Kamchatka. The geography of that migration is written in the shape of the land. During the late Pleistocene, sea levels were nearly 120 meters lower than today. Vast tracts of continental shelf lay exposed, creating an unbroken chain of coastal plains from the Gulf of Tonkin through the East China Sea and the Sea of Japan to the Kuril Islands. Offshore, the Japanese archipelago was a peninsula of the Asian mainland, easily reachable by foot or by primitive boats. From there, the route curved north toward the Kurils and Kamchatka, where kelp forests and salmon runs offered a year-round bounty. The Bennett and Fu study notes that the Ong-related ancestry found along ancient Chinese and Japanese coasts, but absent inland, suggests exactly such a shoreline dispersal. These early mariners followed the ecological corridor of the Pacific Rim long before it became submerged. 30,000 years ago, the cold but navigable seas off Hokkaido and the southern Kamchatka Peninsula would have beckoned to any people skilled in paddling, net-making, and the carving of hollow logs. The technology was simple yet transformative, a fire-hollowed trunk, waterproofed with resin and guided by wooden paddles. Experiments with such craft show they can travel tens of kilometers a day, more than enough to hop between the islands that then dotted the northern Pacific. The Jōmon's ancestors, who already possessed these maritime skills, could easily have reached the Beringian coast thousands of years before the great continental glaciers receded. The crossing from Asia to Alaska was never a single heroic leap. Instead, it was a slow drift of families, perhaps separated by centuries, moving along a living archipelago that no longer exists. At the glacial maximum, sea levels were so low that many of the modern islands of the Aleutian chain were connected by wide coastal plains. The Kelp Highway, as marine archaeologists call it, extended from Japan to the Commander Islands, across to the Aleutians, and finally to the Alaskan Peninsula. Rich in shellfish, seaweed and fish, it offered food for a people used to the tides. By the time they reached the Bering Coast, these voyagers had spent thousands of years adapting to colder climates, much as the Jōmon later would in northern Japan. Their bones, like those of Liu Jiang, likely retained the robust facial architecture of tropical ancestors, while their skin and metabolism had begun to adjust to northern light. Genetic evidence from ancient East Asians shows early selection for cold tolerance and fat metabolism around this time, suggesting that the ancestors of both the Jōmon and the first Americans faced similar environmental pressures. Far across the world, the descendants of those voyagers left their most surprising mark in South America. In 2015, geneticists analyzing ancient remains from Brazil and Patagonia noticed something startling. A small but distinct portion of their DNA resembled that of Australasian peoples, Papuan, Melanesian, and Aboriginal Australian groups. This signal, nicknamed Population Y for Wipikuera, or ancestor in the Tupi language, appears in some of the continent's earliest genomes. Later studies confirmed it. The ancient individual from Cueva Ayayema in Chilean Patagonia carried 3% of this Australasian-like ancestry, and similar traces appeared in ancient individuals from Lagoa Santa in Brazil. None of this could have been introduced by recent Pacific contact. It was too old, too deeply embedded. The only plausible explanation is that an early migration from Asia carried this genetic signature across the Pacific or Bering region before the main wave of northern Eurasian ancestry swept into the Americas. These Australasian relics were likely the direct descendants of that same coastal population that produced the Australasians and eventually the Jōmon. They were not the Jōmon themselves, nor were they related to the much later Polynesians. They were older, bearers of a genetic heritage rooted in southern China and island Southeast Asia, who had reached the Americas tens of millennia before the ancestors of the Clovis culture appeared. In southern China, the newly redated Lujiang skeleton from Tongtianyan Cave stands as a representative of that early coastal population. Once thought to be over 100,000 years old, uranium series and optically stimulated luminescence dating now fix Lujiang's age between 33 and 23,000 years ago. The skull is fully modern, yet carries archaic hints: broad cheekbones, a low nasal bridge, and a braincase of generous size. Its features link it more closely to the Minatogawa people of Okinawa and even to Upper Paleolithic humans in Japan than to the later Han Chinese of the plains. This is a crucial clue. The Lujiang man lived at the same time as the first clear stirrings of the Jōmon lineage farther east. Morphologically, the Jōmon shared traits with Australo-Papuan groups and with the Huabinian hunter-gatherers of mainland Southeast Asia. Wide faces, strong brow ridges, and long skulls adapted to a life outdoors. Genetic modelling places their split from the ancestral East Asians between 38 and 25,000 years ago, which means they diverged long before the formation of the later Northeast Asian populations that would dominate China and Siberia. In other words, the ancestors of the Jōmon, Lujiang, and the earliest American migrants all belonged to the same ancient coastal stock, a people who had branched off early and moved north along the Asian shoreline, while the rest of humanity was still concentrated in tropical refuges. For a time, the discovery of Kennewick Man in Washington state and Spirit Cave Man in Nevada seemed to offer a shortcut to this mystery. His long skull and projecting face reminded physical anthropologists of Polynesians and Ainu, leading to early speculation that he might represent a Jōmon descendant. But genetics has rewritten that story. Kennewick Man and Spirit Cave Man lived only about 9 to 10,000 years ago, far too late to represent the first wave of settlers. When DNA was finally sequenced, it showed that they belonged squarely within the genetic spectrum of Native Americans, particularly those of the Pacific Northwest. The true link lies far deeper in time, among the ancestral populations that had diverged 20,000 years before either Kennewick Man or the Jōmon were born. The mistake was not foolish. Morphology alone, without DNA, often paints misleading resemblances. The Jōmon's dolichocephalic heads and robust features mirrored those of early Americans simply because both descended from the same ancient Asian root. They were distant cousins, separated by more than 15,000 years of isolation, not parent and child. The Jōmon culture flourished in Japan for over 10,000 years, a long arc of continuity unrivaled anywhere else. Their pottery, among the oldest in the world, appears before the dawn of agriculture. Their villages clustered along coasts and rivers, sustained by shellfish, salmon and deer. Genetic and dental studies show that the Jōmon retained the sundadont pattern typical of Southeast Asia rather than the cynodont configuration found in later northern Asians. This detail alone reveals their antiquity. They had branched off before the East Asian dental complex evolved in the north. Cranial studies link them not only to Lujiang, but also to the Minatogawa people of Okinawa, who lived between 18 and 16,000 years ago, and to older fossils in China, such as those of Zhoukudian. Their faces, broad and low, with prominent cheekbones and concave noses, speak of adaptation to diverse climates and a life of hunting, fishing, and living off the land. If the genetic models are correct, the Jōmon's ancestors had lingered in the Japanese archipelago since the time when it was still attached to the mainland. Cut off by rising seas after the Ice Age, they preserved an ancient genetic profile, while the continents beyond were transformed by migrations from the north. In genomic space, the Jōmon form a distinct cluster that branches off from the main East Asian tree between 38 and 25,000 years ago. This means that they separated soon after the ancestors of modern Papuans and Australians diverged from the rest of humanity. They are closer to the early East Asians represented by the 40,000-year-old Tianyuan individual from near Beijing than to any later Chinese population. This deep split explains why traces of their ancestral type appear in unexpected places. The genetic analyses of Patagonia and Brazil show not a recent Jōmon signature, but one derived from the same ancient coastal population. Both groups, Jōmon and Australasian-related Americans, stem from that earlier offshoot of East Asians who had hugged the coast northward. For perhaps 10 or 15,000 years after their arrival in the Americas, these Australasian-related pioneers may have occupied limited niches along the Pacific coast. Then came the second Great Migration, a wave of northern East Asians carrying a different genetic signature, one that dominates the Americas today. These were the ancestors of most Native American peoples. They entered through Beringia around 20,000 years ago, bringing new technologies and mixing with or replacing the earlier coastal dwellers. Yet, the older lineage did not vanish completely. It persisted in pockets, especially in South America's far south, where isolation preserved its faint genetic accent. The result is a continent whose first inhabitants carried two intertwined stories, one of ancient maritime explorers from the tropical coasts of Asia, and another of inland hunters who followed later through the icy north. Taken together, the Lujiang fossil, the Jōmon genome, and the Australasian traces in South America form a coherent pattern. They reveal that East Asia 30,000 years ago was not an isolated corner, but a launching pad for human expansion. Southern China, Southeast Asia, and Japan were home to populations who mastered both land and sea. The Jōmon people were heirs to the same migration that left footprints on the shores of the South China Sea and genetic fingerprints in Patagonia. These findings also reframe humanity's relationship with the ocean. For centuries, scholars imagined that seafaring began with the Mediterranean or the Polynesians, but the evidence from Asia suggests that humans were coastal navigators tens of millennia earlier. The wooden canoes of the Jōmon were not innovations of the Holocene. They were continuations of a tradition that had already carried people from Sunda to Japan and from Japan to the threshold of Alaska. What remains is to fill in the missing chapters. Ancient DNA from submerged coastal sites, now lying under meters of seawater from Taiwan to Hokkaido, could reveal the intermediate stages of this journey. The sediments of Sakhalin, the Kurils, and the Aleutians may yet contain bones of those first mariners who bridged the Pacific. Each discovery pushes back the horizon of what was possible for Ice Age humans. The recent redating of Lujiang, showing that modern humans occupied southern China by 33,000 years ago, reinforces the idea that the Pacific Rim was a continuous cultural sphere. Within that sphere, maritime skills, genetic exchange, and artistic expression flowed freely. From this crucible emerged not only the ancestors of the Jōmon, but also the pioneers whose descendants would one day carve petroglyphs in Chile and sing to the sea in California. The story of the first Americans is no longer one of a single crossing over ice, but of a diaspora that began thousands of miles south among tropical rivers and mangrove coasts. It is a story in which the Jōmon of Japan, the Lujiang man of China, and the ancient peoples of Patagonia share a common ancestry older than any nation or race. These were the first mariners of the world, craftsmen who tamed water with fire-hollowed wood, whose children watched the stars over the Pacific, and whose legacy endures in the faces of both Asia and the Americas. Kennewick Man, the once mysterious skeleton from Washington, was not their direct descendant, but he was their echo. His people carried within them the blended inheritance of that early coastal humanity, layered through time by new arrivals. His resemblance to the Jōmon was not an illusion, but a reminder that the Pacific had been a bridge long before it was a barrier. Science has finally caught up with what the bones and faces have whispered for decades. The first Americans and the Jōmon were children of the same tide. Their ancestors followed the curve of Asia's coast 30,000 years ago, leaving traces in the caves of Guangxi, the islands of Japan, and the cliffs of Patagonia. They built their lives from the sea, moving not by conquest but by continuity, their oars cutting through the same waters that still connect the continents today. When we look across the Pacific now, from Hokkaido's rocky shores to Alaska's fjords, from Chile's channels to Japan's bays, we are seeing the highway of those first dreamers. They did not know they were discovering a new world. They were simply following the edge of the old one paddle stroke at a time. Thank you for watching and exploring our other videos in these links.